Hi, everyone. This is Shirley Zhang from Drive Commerce. I am VP of Product and Project Strategy here at Drive, and thank you for attending one of our first webinars in this Customizer Readiness series. I just wanted to kind of kick it off today and then pass it over to Ryan Bell, who's our Chief Strategy Officer, for the rest of the webinar today. Feel free at the very end to pop in any questions that you guys have. We're happy to answer as much as we can on today's call, or happy to follow up with anybody as well afterwards if there are any more specific questions that we didn't have time to cover. And at the very end of this webinar, there is a survey. Hopefully, gives us a better idea where you are in your company in terms of your customization journey, or just, again, any general questions that you may have and how we can help you kind of in this journey and next steps. So with that said, I will pass it over to Ryan to start. And again, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Shirley. As Shirley mentioned, I'm Ryan Bell. I'm one of the partners here at Drive Commerce. And this is the first in a series of webinars that we're going to be doing that we call Custom 101, which is really talking about how organizations can go through the process of setting up or revitalizing an existing customization process for their products, and some of the key pitfalls and things that we've seen along the way to try to help you set up a program that's really going to last through scaling and growth into becoming like a long-term sales channel for your organization. So today is the first in this series of three. We're going to be talking primarily about product data models and how to prepare and how to think about your product model as it applies to customization. In future sessions, we're going to cover things like UX and post-purchase, which I'll talk a little bit about more later. But today is really all about the product. And so our target audience, if you're a brand, a manufacturer, a retailer who is exploring customization or personalization for your products, maybe you've already had some experience in this field and you're looking to kind of take it to the next level. Hopefully, you're going to find a lot of good nuggets of wisdom in here today. So as I mentioned, we're gonna dive into sort of the product components of this and just start talking through that today. As Shirley mentioned, if you have questions as we go, please feel free to. I think there's an option to drop those into the chat, and we'll cover off on as many of those as we can at the end here, while being respectful of everyone's time. So with that, let's dive in and talk a little bit about the product reality check, right? So we've, over the hundreds of customization experiences that we've built for clients over the last decade or so, we've found a lot of, hard-won learnings, we'll say. We've tripped over various things and bumped our head on the ceiling a couple of times. And so, we know that most product customization initiatives are actually going to, if they're going to fail before you've even gotten to the software selection standpoint or software selection phase, which is where we're at. And so we want to make sure that we're, helping you prepare for the ability to scale and grow as you launch a custom or a personalizable process or product at your organization. And hopefully through some of the experiences we'll talk about today, you can learn to avoid some of the pitfalls that we see pretty commonly. So talking quickly about what we're going to learn today, we're going to go through the difference between the basic types of customizable product and help you understand what type of product you might be dealing with. We'll talk through, how to structure SKUs, IDs, components, basically the architecture of customization and how to apply that to your product in your scenario. And then we'll talk a little bit about, like I say, some of the common data modeling that mistakes that we see that really derail customization projects. And finally, we have a little bit of a readiness checklist that you can use to kind of self-evaluate where you're at and get a feel for, what more work you might have to do in this kind of phase one of understanding your product. So with that, let's talk a little bit more in detail about customization itself. We generally view customization as falling into one of three categories, and these are not mutually exclusive, right? So we identify products generally as configurable, combinatorial, or personalizable. Talking a little bit about configurable products, this is probably the most common type that we see, and this is generally an evolution of an existing product assortment, right? So for example, if you sell sofas, this is a really common one where you start to outgrow your existing e-commerce platform very quickly if you're trying to support a product like this through the use of variants or option selections, right? If you can think about a sofa, even a very simple one, it might be a left hand or a right hand configuration, maybe with a chaise or without a chaise. And then you've got 15 different materials that come in 25 different colors with different waterproofing or stain guards, that kind of thing. In most cases, you've already exceeded the maximum number of variants that are allowed. So when we're talking about an e-commerce platform like Shopify, which has a limit of around 2,000 variants, or Salesforce with 1,000, other platforms are going to have their own limitations. As soon as your product gets to a point where that matrix has outgrown the ability of your e-commerce platform to service it, that's when you're really going to start thinking about a customization platform that's standalone. This can happen in other areas too. You might consider someone who's a manufacturer who's been building the same type of shoe for a long time, right? And they have many different colors and variants there. So configurable products often grow out of an existing kind of complex base product that someone is building. To contrast that then a little bit with combinatorial products, combinatorial is less of a matrix, right? If we think about the sofa choices as being as kind of growing, sort of squarely or linearly in each direction, combinatorial products are a little bit more fuzzy, right? This is where we're talking more about kind of the rules that make a valid product versus an invalid product. And if you consider something like Funko, where I can have an accessory in each hand of my figure, I can have an accessory in neither hand, and then I can customize those accessories further. You get into a little bit of iteration or recursion. Maybe I can also have two figures, and I want to do one or many customizations to each of those. And so, really, what we're setting up then in a combinatorial scenario is a set of rules that define a valid product versus an invalid product. And so, we are less concerned about someone filling in the required checkboxes of the matrix that we're trying to build, and more that the selections that they have made fit within the universe of rules that create a valid product. It's a little bit of a subtle difference, but often combinatorial products come from a different place where they're more greenfield. So where I mentioned that, configurable products we often see grow out of an existing product line, your combinatorial products are generally going to come from a more greenfield kind of a place, and often from the side of manufacturing more than customer preferences, if that makes sense. And then finally, we talk about personalizable products. And I think personalizable is really the one more than the others that breaks the categories a little bit, because personalization can apply to base products that are already in your assortment that are not otherwise customizable, or you could apply personalization on top of a configurable or a combinatorial product, right? And this could also apply to packaging as well. So, if we have a client who does different, mixed drinks, and you can kind of determine what cocktail you want to have in the bottle. And then the personalization applies to the actual last step of customizing or personalizing that label. And so personalization can really apply across the board. And really, this applies to customers or consumers wanted to generate their own content text and apply that to a specific area of a specific product, right? So quick tips on these before we leave aside the sort of categories of customization products. When you're thinking about configurable products, in a way, you're thinking of picking from known variants, right? And it may be a very large matrix that you're picking from, but in general, you are picking from defined combinations that you could find within a table, right? It's important to consider, if you're thinking about a configurable product, that not all configurable products deserve a full customization experience, right? And so if we're thinking about a product that is merely hitting the limits of its e-commerce platform, is there a valid use case for customers to want to actually customize that product or personalize that product? Or is it more that just our product creation team is really creative and has a lot of different angles for this, right? I think it's most often the case that when you hit that limit with one product, a lot of times I think teams have a tendency to try to bring in too many other products along with it, right? So we're going to do customization, and rather than start with this one base product, we're going to bring in 10 more. Not all of those products are likely to need their own customization experience at that point. And so I think it's really important, if you're looking at a configurable product, to really understand what is the complexity, what are we trying to make easier for the consumer, and then make sure that use case is validated and justified. Combinatorial products, on the other hand, I think it's important to recognize when it's time to take the step into a combinatorial product, right? And this really comes back to the rules example. So if I have, just a series of options and I can pick one or none options for each of those options, I don't really need a rule for that other than to say these fields are required and these fields are optional, right? But if there are rules that would go beyond this, right? Like I can't combine these two types of things because they just don't go together. You can't print this, black text on a black background, something like that. Something that's more rules based and less about the actual kind of placements of items within a product. That's when you're looking at something that's more combinatorial. I also don't want to give you the impression you should go to combinatorial right away because your product is complex, right? Oftentimes, complex rule sets are not needed to validate a product, especially one that is configurable or personalizable. And so I only point this out to say that, it's important to understand if you have a combinatorial product, you're going to be writing rule sets and everything. If not, stick to one of the other ones as much as you can. And then personalizable products, I often talk about this as a broad approach, right? So typically, if you have the capability to personalize one product in your assortment, you often will have the ability to personalize many of the products within the assortment, right? And so, if we're doing water bottles as well as commuter mugs, as well as backpacks or something like that, this can broadly apply to your assortment. The other way in which personalization is very broad is that you are typically going to be dealing with multiple types of fonts, sizing, special characters, emojis. If you're doing image uploads, you're going to deal with rights management and being able to ensure that the image is going to print into the printable or engravable area. So personalizable, it can be very easy to start with from the perspective of you don't need to do that much to an existing product model to enable personalization. But when you consider the broadness of the selection criteria on the other side, it can become a little bit more complicated from there. So this is a little bit simpler upfront and more complicated on the back end. Okay, so now that we understand a little bit more, we have some shared terminology in terms of what the different types of customization are. Let's dive into some of the more technical pieces that we want to consider when we're bringing our product data over and prepping it for customization. And to put it another way, which systems are invited to the customization party? What are their snack requests? And what party tricks do they perform? I asked AI to make this sub headline a little bit more fun because the next page is mostly a swim lane diagram. So hopefully that was fun. Time for swim lanes. This is going to be a pretty simple walkthrough. This is an oversimplification in most cases, but really the point I want to drive home here is that we should start thinking about customization in terms of two swim lanes. The e-commerce catalog platform that's going to do some of the basic functions that we need to fulfill on orders, and then the customization platform, which we're just going to put in quotes for right now. This can be an extension of your e-commerce platform. This could be a totally separate system. These two things can have different kind of power sharing agreements. But in reality, I think the best mental model to hold is just this kind of two swim lanes where we have our traditional e-commerce and we have our customization on the other side. And so within the e-commerce platform, we're going to have our base product. And this is really going to be a representation of the kind of base model that you could order, right? Probably no one would order this because, it's gray, it doesn't have anything on it. But this is going to be the representation so that we can display this like our other products when it comes to merchandising, search and sorting, all the things that you want your e-commerce platform to do, up to and including the cart and the checkout, right? Conversely, in the customization platform, then we're going to think about the product as a blueprint. So this is all of the possibilities that we could have with this product, right? So this is taking it down from this base product, which may have, kind of skin applied to it or something already as a representation, to say these are all the things that we can change or modify about this product or allow the user to customize on their side, right? And so this is inclusive of the options and the placements and everything that we want to offer. The combination of these two things then results in our customer experience, right? So this is where the user is going to make their selections, preview the model that they're building, and then submit to us a recipe for what they want to have. And that's where we get the concept of a custom recipe, right? So the combination of what is possible, what is possible with the base product into the customer experience then results in a custom recipe for us to fulfill against. And we're going to share this down into our cart, our ordering. Eventually, it's going to go downstream to some sort of fulfillment, whether that's manufacturing, warehouse, whatever it is. And then ideally, we're going to get some analytics and metrics back for our customization program. And I'll talk a little bit about this more in depth, but I think it's an important consideration to realize that your traditional tracking methodology for e-commerce is going to leave a lot on the table when it comes to customization and personalization, things that you're really going to want to dig into, especially when it comes to growing and scaling the platform. So really important to include the analytics and metrics feedback loop in there as well. Generally, we would consider that part of the customization platform since it's so specific to what we're going to be doing on that side. So now that we understand, sort of the basic workflow here of how things are going to be set up, let's talk a little bit about some of the common product pitfalls that we see when it comes to modeling that data into our systems, right? And I'm going to start with the first one, which I kind of just talked about, which is when you're confusing variants with customization architecture, right? So oftentimes, this is really the first conversation that we have with many clients is we are outgrowing our ability to offer the combinations of this product that we want to within our e-commerce platform. And that can be, a hard limit based on variants. It could be a performance limit based on, changing out imagery and things like that. But oftentimes we find that, if you are outgrowing the capabilities of your e-commerce platform to support a highly configurable product, you are probably getting into the area where you need to start looking at customization. And if you try to stay with this for too long, the approach is going to become really brittle, right? You're going to end up having to break things out or, losing customers in the flow of trying to get them to the right area to customize the thing that they want to. And so really, ultimately, I think this is the biggest pitfall that we see is out there right now. There are tons of teams who are trying to manage things in a substandard system that just isn't built for the customization that they want to be doing or could be doing. The second one that we see, I think, most often is trying to embed business logic into the front end instead of, kind of building that into the product model or the back end validation as much as possible. And so, whenever you are considering where to conduct validation, and I'll go back here to, or rather, I'll say, it's important to do some level of validation and communication in the front end, right? I think that's probably obvious. So if you look at, for example, like submitting imagery to be used in engraving or printing, one thing you might say from a front end validation perspective is ensure that you have the rights to use this image, right? That it's not copyrighted or that you are otherwise enabled to use that image for this purpose. And that's just a general statement to the user to try to get them, in the right mindset of not using something that's copyrighted, but then allowing them to play around and continue, experimenting with the customization or building out the configuration that they want to use. On the back end, then you can do some additional validation, maybe pipe that through an AI model or something to look for copyrighted imagery, logos, and that sort of thing, so that you're not doing that interruptively in the front end layer, right? If you do too much validation in the front end, you end up interrupting the user's flow, and they will often be taken out of it and possibly leave. You also end up impacting performance in many cases, right? You want this interface that the customer is using to be the fastest, most performant, very interactive. And if it's constantly interrupting them or trying to go to a back-end service and do validation, that's going to be interruptive as well, and it's going to reflect in lower conversion rates. Not separating your placements from options. So this is like these are my big three, right? So this is the third one, and this one I think is it feels like it may not be very important, but once you see a customization program at scale, it becomes apparent how very important this is from the beginning, right? And so I think, the way that I typically explain this is to say, if you think about, we're going to make a watch customization, right? We might define something as a black leather watch band as a component, right? But really, that's way too specific. If we're going to call something a black leather watch band, we're already implying that this can only apply to watches. It must be the component called a band. It's already made of leather, and we're determining the color. And so really what we should do is break that down into the placement is a band, right? It's not a watch band because we'll apply it to the product and it will inherit that context from the product. So we should just call it a band. Black and leather then are two different qualitative judgments that we would say this one is the color and this one is the material. And so by breaking those things down, we're already starting to build a product model that's going to be much more sustainable and durable going forward, as opposed to having to go back and rename everything. Oh, this isn't a black leather watch band anymore. We're using this across, so we've got to call it a leather strap or something, right? You're going to save yourself a ton of rework and honestly just set yourself up for more success in the long term if you start to consider from the beginning that placements are separate from color, which are separate from material, which are separate from, depending on your business, it could be multiple other things. So continuing on, creating product-specific options for everything is a little bit related to my previous point. But if you're constantly creating product-specific options, your maintenance is just going to explode, right? So just going beyond even the placements and kind of breaking things out into their component parts, um, you know, trying to increase reuse as much as possible is the name of the game when it comes to having an efficient customization process, right? So you want to avoid creating unique options for each product, even if you think, oh, this is a component called the watch crown. We couldn't possibly reuse this anywhere. I think it's still important to just make it as generic as possible because it's really difficult to foresee down the road when you will need this. So if you're using the same zipper, if it's the same material, define it once and reuse it many times. And if over time you realize like, oh, this is really just product specific and we could call it something else, that's a much better problem to have than going the other way. Poor governance and taxonomy. I think anyone who's worked in e-commerce or probably many industries for any given amount of time, especially ones that are technology heavy, has had a gripe about governance around, style codes, product IDs, display names. All that has a tendency to drift over time, and no one is saying that you have to be perfect at this, right? But if you are in the mode right now, which, by I think signing up for this webinar, you probably are in the mode of trying to think about how to do customization or do customization better. One key aspect of this is going to be your governance around your taxonomy, right? Like, how do you manage things like style codes and fulfillment recipes? Does it make sense to the merchandisers? Does it make sense to your fulfillment partners? Developing the most robust strategy that you can, and then finding ways to communicate and enforce that is going to make your life easier down the road by orders of magnitude, honestly. So I think, just making sure you have this because so your recipes will stay trustworthy over time makes maintenance much easier for your folks who are doing the kind of building out of these products as well. Ignoring versioning. So this is maybe a little bit out of left field because I don't know that a ton of platforms out there have really adopted this at the level that we have. But I view this as critical for retailers who are, well, if you have seasonal product turnovers, this is critical, right? If you need to be prepping your fall holiday for during your spring summer season or something, having a different version that you can use in a testing environment is going to be huge. And I think that also applies to products that are highly technical. So if you have like new versions of a product coming out, you need to be able to test kind of different components or new placements within that. That'll be really useful as well. Fashion products, if you have limited releases of components or materials, things like that, those can also really benefit from a versioning capability, right, or a versioning workflow. Even if it's not explicit to your platform, having the ability to version products and then test them and say this is our new version, this is our test version or staging version. It makes life so much easier because if you consider your current e-commerce process, you most likely have this in place at some level for traditional product. So why not have it for customization as well? And so thinking about how you're going to do that versioning from the beginning is really important. Treating personalization just like any other option. And this goes back a little bit to, trying to leverage a platform that's not built for this purpose to do this. But going beyond that, if you think about things like free-form text fields or product file uploads or any other kind of user-generated content, those all require different levels of validation or different types of validation. And if you're ending up trying to build that into a platform that isn't ready for that, you're going to add a lot of additional complexity. And again, you'll probably see performance hits and things along those lines. Preview and moderation is another really big part of this. So being able to, if I'm personalizing a product, being able to preview that to the customer in a way that's going to make the most sense to them and actually represent what they're going to get at the end is also really, really important. And if you're trying to treat personalization just like any other option, I think you're going to run into some blockers from that perspective, even if it's kind of downstream from the actual purchase order where the customer receives the product and it didn't accurately represent the stitching or the engraving that they were looking for. You may end up with returns and complaints and things like that in a process that dies over time. So think about personalization as separate in customization to a degree as well, but personalization I think is typically where we see this pitfall come under fire, where people run into this pitfall most often. Underdefined business rules. So related a little bit to the validation in the front end is defining your business rules and really understanding what is a valid product and what is not. And of course, this applies a little bit more to combinatorial products than it does to others. But really, under any circumstance, there are going to be underlying business rules. And I go back to can I print black text on a black background, right? Or same color on same color background. In some cases, that might look really cool, right? If I have a matte black product with a gloss black font or something on that, that might be great. But you need to think about your business, your product, your fulfillment process, and really consider, are there business rules that we need to put in place here that would prevent someone from creating a product they're not going to be happy with? And only you and your manufacturing partners and fulfillment partners are going to know what those are really. And so it's important to dig in and start to define some of those business rules before you really get going on building out the rest of the interface. A poor option ordering strategy. This is another one that's maybe a little bit esoteric or vague to folks who aren't involved in this every single day. But if you think about, let's take a shoe as an example, right? If I'm the person who's making the shoe, I'm the manufacturer, I might consider it easiest to think about it from the perspective of building it from the bottom up, right? I start with an outer sole, and there's an inner sole, and then I start to build up the walls and the saddle and then the top. But as a consumer of shoes, someone who looks at my shoes regularly, I'm always looking at them from the top down, right? I see the toe caps, I see the laces. That's the part that matters more to me or that I think about first. And so as the person in your organization responsible for sort of blending these two perspectives of the manufacturer and the consumer, it's important to consider that you should have a flexible product model that allows you to display things in a different order, right? If as the customer, I prefer to choose the toe cap and the laces first and then move on to the rest, that's important to know and to display it in that order in the UX. And then from a fulfillment and manufacturing perspective, if I prefer it in a different order, like I need to know which sole I'm going to grab first, you should be able to reorder that data into that context so that I get the data that I need, right? So very important to ensure that you have the flexibility in your option ordering as much as possible, and then consider how the ordering strategy you're going to present to different audiences depending on what their role is in this process. All right, just a few more, and then I promise we'll move on to some more fun things. But cloning instead of abstracting, right? So anytime, first of all, I'll just say it's a great feature to be able to have the duplicate product option, right? So I think that's kind of table stakes, and that's really good to have. What I don't want to encourage is relying on that, right? So if you're duplicating or cloning a product, the minute you are hitting that copy, clone, duplicate button, you should be thinking to yourself, how do I abstract this, right? Like, what am I going to do next with this? Because in most cases, you're not actually creating a pure clone of that product, right? There's almost no reason to ever have two of the exact same thing on the site, unless you're doing like a different site or something like that, but they wouldn't be next to each other. So outside of those specific cases, what we really want to be focused on when it comes to cloning is how do we abstract this? What am I going to change about this copy that I just made? And what does that say about my product model, right? If I'm going to copy this and I'm going to say, oh, we don't call this a watch strap anymore, I'm going to change it to band. I need to go back and change that about my other product too. And in doing so, you'll start to create pockets of reusability where you can say, oh, wait, if I call this a band, I can use this across multiple products, right? And so anytime you're starting to do that kind of cloning duplication process, I think it's important to just plant a flag and say, how do we think about this from an abstract perspective? And what could I do that will make this easier the next time I need to clone one of these products? No clear ownership of data and process. I think this is another one that's just probably echoed in many industries and especially in e-commerce, right? Where oftentimes the entire business may live between IT and marketing and direct to consumer or something, right? And so I think, probably everyone on this call understands a little bit about the in-betweenness of these types of processes. Um, Customization in general is by its nature cross-functional, right? We're going to show the product on the website. We're going to, engage with someone in terms of manufacturing and fulfillment. There's just cross-functionality baked into the process. So establishing an owner of that customization piece, I think one thing that it does is obviously it gives you someone to have responsibility and accountability for what the customization process or product is going to look like, right? And that can live anywhere, it really is dependent upon the organization and who's got the initiative to take that. But I think that the other thing that this does is it helps define the boundaries more broadly between all these cross-functional areas, right? So that a person who is saying, oh, okay, I am taking ownership over the ID and naming conventions for our custom components is also then going to naturally go understand where that ends, right? There may be someone in IT or who manages the ERP system or in product development who determines product codes, and you're going to have to interface and have a conversation with them about, not overlapping and where does your definitions end and theirs begin. By doing so, you're drawing the borders around where customization lives as a process and as a sales channel. And that in turn is kind of a feedback loop that's going to give this person their more defined responsibility. So just getting someone to raise their hand and say, I take responsibility for customization as a program or a process at our organization, that owner then can grow with the process from there, right? But very important to have someone who's willing to take that on from the start. And finally, not planning for external system mapping. This one is just a heartbreaker, honestly. It's one of those things that sounds like, yeah, how could you possibly get anywhere without understanding those connections? And I think, some of these are very obvious, right? Again, the connection to the e-commerce platform. We want to be able to show the product. We want people to be able to put it in their cart and check out with it, right? How do we do that? We need fulfillment. So we need to be able to send this down to our warehouse management or manufacturing software. That's a very obvious connection. But if we are talking about things like post-purchase communication, how do we show the same visualization or preview that the customer saw to them in their follow-up emails as they saw in the first interface? How do we message that to customer service so they understand what's going on? How do we include those things in emails? All of that is really important to understand and what those connection points are and what they need to look like. And leaving any of this until the last minute is just a recipe for disaster because you will have built up so much momentum on both sides to connect all of these cross-functional processes. And if there's a conflict in how they connect, it can bring the whole project down and really put it on hold for indefinitely in some cases. Okay, so now that we've learned so much about all the pitfalls that we could possibly run into, let's revisit our diagram with some intentionality and talk about the things that we're going to do when we build out this process so that we don't run into some of those common pitfalls, right? So again, we're gonna think about this separation between our e-commerce platform and the customization platform. We're going to treat our sellable product and style code as distinct from the customization piece of this, right? This goes back to our base product and our blueprint. They're distinct entities and they're different from each other. And that is going to allow us to have that deeper custom product architecture live elsewhere and not interfere with our merchandising, our pricing, our inventory processes that take place in that main e-commerce platform. And then we're going to use that base product style to represent the commercial item, right? So this is what we're building is kind of separating this into two different things. We're using that base product as our stand-in whenever we're doing merchandising, pricing, promotional activity on the site. And then the corollary to that is that we have our blueprint where we're going to be very specific about making our placement separate from our options. So we're going to call things left panel, band, case, so that we can kind of extrapolate that out to future growth in the system. We're going to model our components as reusable building blocks to make it easier for our customer experience. And then that'll also make our lives easier for reusability in future launches. We're going to speaking of launches, we'll use product versions intentionally, right? We want to make sure that we know when we have a new version coming out, what's in test, what is existing, what is in the past. Using versioning very intentionally will keep your customer experience very clean and very non-problematic for them to use, right? We're going to include custom metadata on our blueprint objects when we're sending those down. This is going to help enhance the capability of our manufacturing and fulfillment partners to understand what they're building and make sure that it is to the spec that the customer understands. We'll also reuse these visualizations to give the customer more confidence that they're going to get what they ordered, right? So we'll reuse this when we communicate with them. Hey, your order is accepted. It's being manufactured right now. Every time we're using that same picture of what they personalized or what they customized, so that we're building that trust. And then not only, we expect that we're going to get analytics and metrics back from our customization platform, but we need to be prepared to review them, right? We've had clients who joined us and they mine into their data and say, oh, we really should be doing group orders based on the way that this is working. It's the activity of reviewing that customization level analytics that really is going to help feed and grow your platform going forward. So making time to review that, making sure you're reviewing the customization specific metrics that you have access to, is going to be really important for growth going forward. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about a checklist at the end here, right? So this is just a quick readiness checklist. You can use this to sort of self-evaluate where you're at. If you have questions on any of this, please feel free to reach out. I'm going to give you a little bit more contact information in a minute. But let's talk just at the top line, can you categorize your product into one of those three categories that we talked about, right? Even if it's a little bit cross-category, we're looking at doing something that's configurable with personalization options, that's fine, but can you name it, right? Because that's going to inform what you need to be thinking about as you're going forward. Where are those pitfalls going to be for your specific product and type? So going further from that, then can you determine what is the base product and then what are the customizable parts and things that would get built into a blueprint, right? So can you already define those things? And it doesn't have to be all the way complete yet, but at least starting to get an idea of what those categories or placements are is going to help you understand the complexity and the nature of your product. And then can you explain that product as a plan and then each customer order as a recipe, right? So could you tell me, hey, this is our custom product. These are the areas that you can customize, and there's some options under there. If you choose X, Y, and Z, this is the product that you would get back, right? It doesn't have to be, again, super detailed, but at a high level, can you explain those things? And is that possible? Because that's going to help you going forward, right? When it comes to data architecture and taxonomy, how will you integrate style, ID, and recipe codes in your manufacturing, customer service, and analytics, right? Do you understand what those existing data models look like and how not to overwrite them now or in the future as both of these programs grow, right? So again, sitting down with folks who are already managing naming and ID conventions and understanding how they view that will help you determine, what lives within the borders of that customization process once again, right? Do you use structured fields for custom metadata instead of unofficial methods? This is a little bit esoteric, but really, do you have your data defined, right? For colors, does that live somewhere in a structured way that you could import to a tool, or is that something that as we've created products over time, we put the color names into the product descriptions, and we have to go extract that somewhere, right? The more structured your data is, and again, this goes back to breaking it down into placement, component, part, piece, material, whatever. The more you can do that breakdown now and understand what that taxonomy is going to look like, the more successful you're going to be down the road. When it comes to rules and validation, are there rules that you would say apply to all valid builds? Obviously, this is going to apply much more to combinatorial products than others, but there are still, going back to the kind of business logic piece of this. Can I print red on a red background, right? Is that going to look good? Is that a possibility with our manufacturing capabilities? I don't know, but that's a good conversation to start to have in terms of defining your data architecture and your business rules. And then can your team explain what is manufactured or fulfilled for a submitted recipe? So if we filled out a quick spreadsheet, like we have clients who started with pen and paper versions of their customization experiences, right? If I ticked some boxes on a piece of paper, could you tell me what I was going to get? Again, this goes back to, a little bit of similarity to the product classification, but, can you identify areas where I'm breaking those validation rules simply? If you're looking for a little bit of extra credit, maybe we just went through that checklist and you're thinking, okay, I think I have all this. Start to think about system integration, right? Have you divided up what's going to be in the e-commerce system versus the customizer? Do you have that defined when it comes to product IDs and how those recipes interface and all that kind of stuff? Is your option ordering purposeful? This goes back to, does it make sense to the consumer versus does it make sense to the manufacturer? For implementation readiness, have you identified all your visual assets, right? So is it going to be a 360-degree spin of your product? Will it just be specific angles? Do you have the capability to represent stitching or engraving on the product in an accurate way? Or, are you currently just thinking of throwing a font over it, right? That's going to have implications for returns and customer complaints, everything down the road. And then have we identified all the necessary visual assets? Excuse me, I'm sorry, I skipped back one. Have we selected a suitable phase one candidate, right? So bottom line, do you have a product identified that you are saying, yeah, this is going to be our phase one launch candidate. This is what we're dealing with. And then go back and make sure we can answer all the questions for that, right? Okay, I think we've got a few minutes left to take questions. I'm just going to put this up here. First, I'll just say thank you so much for attending today. I hope this has been at least a little bit educational in terms of, delivering some of our hard-won experience to you all. We have up here for questions. You can reach out to sales at Drive Commerce. That is just a name. I promise there is no high-pressure sales pitch or anything on the other side of that. If you have questions about this, if you want to, continue to leverage our experience, please do feel free to reach out to that sales email. I get a copy of it. Folks on here will get copies as well. And so, I think that if you have questions about that, please do feel free to reach out. Don't be intimidated. There's no high pressure situation here. Okay, got a couple of questions coming in. What level of preview or visualization is a must-have versus a nice-to-have for launch? That's a great question, and or not again, but it's going to be situationally specific, right? I think the consumer these days is much more advanced than they have ever been, obviously. And so the most visualization that you can provide is going to be the best. Having some visualization, I think, is table stakes, right? So if I personalize something, if I add a monogram and it doesn't show up on the product image right away, I would say that you're losing a major part of your audience right out of the gate there. The second piece of that then is accuracy of the representation. So if I'm doing engraving or embroidery or something like that, representing the stitching or the way that the engraving is going to look as accurately as possible on the product is going to be huge in terms of customer care and returns, exchanges, all that kind of stuff down the road. So I think if you're going to do visualization, doing it as accurately as possible is really the key. If you're going down the road of like, should we do 3D models and all that kind of stuff? I think some of that can wait depending on your product, but again, it's going to be really dependent upon your consumer and what they need to see to make that purchasing decision. What metrics do you recommend tracking to prove customization is working? I love this question because customization is its own beast, right? And so there's kind of two. I want to break this down into two components. One, how do we prove it's working? And two, what should we be tracking, right? So, what metrics to prove it's working? I think AOV is a really big one. Obviously, that's pretty well understood within the industry. You can talk to somebody about AOV and they kind of get what that metric is representing. Custom product is obviously or generally going to lead push the top of your AOV and may drag up your site average AOV as well, because you're often, upselling different pieces of it, and custom products tend to be more expensive anyway. So AOV is a great one to start from to prove the return. You look at things like conversion, it can be a double-edged sword. People really like to play with custom and personalization widgets and things like that. We launched a proof of concept with pop sockets a couple years ago where we integrated an AI generative art component to the phone cases. So you could just say, make me a happy dog, and it'll put it on the phone case for you. And tons of people played with that. And they might make 20 designs before they settle on one that they're gonna purchase, and so the conversion looks terrible. But when you look at the actual volume of orders, there's an increase, right? And so I think it's really AOV is a really good one to look at. The other ones you may need to look at with a little bit of context. I'll say the other thing is that there are metrics that are more specific to customization that you should also be paying attention to. I mentioned before we have a client who joined us from a platform that didn't have any analytics. And when they started digging into it, they realized that they had people who were in there trying to create gift packages for wedding parties. And so they're going through 3, 5, 7 times to do a customization and order a product. And they said, well, we should just really make this a group ordering option, or make a group ordering option for wedding parties and things like that. And overnight, going into wedding season, they blew up their actual conversion not blew up, but it increased quite a bit because they were servicing this market that they couldn't find otherwise except by looking into those analytics. So I would say, top line, you can look at some of the existing commerce metrics out there like AOV to help communicate success of the platform and what it's doing with the site. And then really digging into your actual customization metrics and looking at what people are doing, what they're creating will help give you insight into what to build so that you're continuing to drive those top line metrics. Okay. Any other questions? Anything else to cover off on before we go? Perfect. Well, thank you again, everyone, for attending. We will be following up with, recordings of this as well as supplemental materials and everything. Again, please do feel free to reach out. Sales is the best way to get it. You'll get the most eyeballs on that. But again, I promise no high pressure pitches or anything like that. And yeah, we'll be in touch. Again, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or follow-ups for us. Thank you again for coming, and we hope to see you at the next one.
Thank you, everyone. This concludes our first webinar. Please stay tuned on email or in LinkedIn for updates and reminders on our second series, our second webinar, which is sometime in July. But thanks again for joining, and we'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.